Today, I'm going to be speaking with Ward Farnsworth, who is Dean of the University of Texas Law School and also author of The Socratic Method, a practitioner's handbook. It's so great to have you on today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, David. Good to be here.
So, I talk about the Socratic Method with my audience frequently, and I think maybe the best place to start would be when we say Socratic. There's in that word we're talking about Socrates. So maybe we can start with the origins of why this is a method attributed to Socrates and what it is.
Sure. Well, when people talk about the Socratic method and Socrates, what they usually mean is the style of dialogue and discourse and thinking that you see displayed by Socrates in the dialogues of Plato. We don't really know much about the real Socrates, whether that's how he talked. We know that's how the literary Socrates talked, and that's the model for the Socratic method.
And the model is characterized by questions, but particular types of questions meant to elicit certain type of thinking. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the Socratic method is the greatest tool there is for critical thinking and for testing people's views. It has a lot of features and they're hard to summarize quickly, but usually what Socrates is trying to do is work with the beliefs of the person he's talking to. So Socrates doesn't usually say you're wrong. He says, can we agree on this? Can we agree on that? Well, but if we agree on those things, then what about this other thing that you said? It seems like there's a tension there or an issue. So he basically talks people into contradiction with themselves, which is to me a distinctly effective way of working with people you don't agree with.
One of the things that sometimes is frustrating in the modern landscape is you might get someone to contradict themselves, but they seem unable to recognize that they've contradicted themselves. And so, for example, we see this frequently when I will talk to people who say that Trump is actually the president and it's Joe Biden's fault that gas prices are high. And it's like, well, if Joe Biden's not really the president, how could it be his fault that gas prices are high? That's sort of the contradiction. But sometimes people seem to lack an ability to even understand the contradiction. How would the Socratic method address that?
Well, first of all, if they don't think there's a contradiction, then, and I'm the one using the method, then my feeling is that's on me. My questions have not been skillful enough, or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there isn't a contradiction. They don't think there is one because it looks like there's one to you. But what they mean when they say Donald Trump's really president isn't what you think they mean. They mean this and you think they mean that. And so there's something additional about their meaning that you've got to get to the bottom of. I just think the right way to think about this is always ask whether, if you're not making headway, it's really on them. Take responsibility and see if you can be more empathetic and try to understand what they mean or what they're thinking. That's an important part of the Socratic method is you're trying to get people to come around to your way of thinking. And before you can do that, you kind of got to come around to their way of thinking or really understand it. And not just like what passes for thoughts, not what passes for thought in the minds of these people you think are idiots, but how they actually look at the world and why it makes sense to them. And once you really get that, it's much easier from that standpoint to then bring them around to something that's more like the way you look at things.
One of the things that seems important in the Socratic method is a sort of humility about our own beliefs. And it seems that the approach of asking questions can be humble in a sense, because you're really trying to learn more about what the other person believes, even if your ultimate goal is that you suspect they're wrong and you want to change their mind. At the same time, there's sometimes the assumption that it's more persuasive to appear more confident in what you believe. So is there a balance that needs to be struck, or is it just not true that it's more persuasive to be confident?
Well, I suppose it's hard to generalize. I'm sure there are people who are very persuaded by confidence and not by humility. But the Socratic method, in any event, is founded on humility. I mean, I know the Socratic method sounds fundamentally like a technique for questioning other people and for trying to bring them around, and it's very powerful for that. But to me, first and foremost, it's a style of thought that if you really care about these things, you try to use yourself. So you're questioning what you think, and you're wondering if maybe you're wrong. And so when you're talking to people, you're trying to help questioning for them to see things your way, but you're also alert to the idea that maybe you have something to learn from them. And I think that one byproduct of that approach is that if you're humble in that way, you're more likely to make headway with others. But you're also more likely to make headway in seeing your own short-sightedness, which is, of course, something we should all want.
Can we talk through in practice how this might sort of appear in if it's happening at, the Thanksgiving table is often the one people call in. They say, I know my uncle believes that we could just stick with my uncle believes Trump won. He just believes it was stolen. He believes Joe Biden stole it. And he's going to bring it up and he's going to say, can you guys believe what Joe Biden was able to get away with? And people want sort of a framework with which they can, without upsetting people, without ruining relationships, start a gentle Socratic inquiry. What types of questions might we ask in that situation?
Well, good question. I mean, the first question is, is it worthwhile at the Thanksgiving table to try to chase this down?
Let's assume it is. Let's assume it is.
I know,
this person.
We'll assume it is, but I just mean you can be Socratic about the value of using these methods in a given moment. But putting that to one side.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, to me, the goal is always, can you find some common ground? Can you find something you agree on that you can then build from? So saying something like, look, here's what I'm interested in. What would you be willing to count as evidence that the election wasn't stolen, or what are you going to count as evidence of anything? I mean, let's just take something that's less controversial and just see if we can agree on that. How do you know that somebody else won the presidential election? Let's talk about an election we can agree on. Right. How do you know who won that election? I'm just interested. I mean, I'm really wondering how do you think about that? Because in the sense we don't know, all we know is what we read in the paper. So what makes you so sure that somebody you like that Donald Trump won the first election? And let them explain that for a while. And you say, okay, so that's interesting. So I guess what I'm wondering now is, of those things you mentioned, how many of those things are not also present in the election you are worried about? And so trying to find an election you can agree on before you start talking about an election you can't agree on, I think is a helpful approach. And I would just use that approach in general, is try to find a case you can agree on and then talk through what that case is about, and then try to use what you've established in your easy case to sort of gently ask about the hard case.
That's really interesting. It seems there's maybe, in thinking about the empathy component there as well, there might be an opportunity also to find common ground in this conversation to say, are we on the same page that we both want whoever really won to be the president, right? Are we on the same page that's ultimately what we want? We want to know who really won, but that person should definitely be the president. It seems that might also be useful.
Definitely, but then of course, I think everybody would agree on that. That's a good thing to start with, and then you'd say, okay, now the question is, what does it mean to say somebody really won?
Yeah.
Like, do you mean somebody who got the most popular vote, or do you mean the person who won the electoral college? Forget about Trump for a minute. Just what do we mean in general? And you keep trying to build agreements on things, and once you have these agreements in place, you narrow everything down. And I still think that, I mean, in these conversations, of course, you're always hopefully thinking, look, maybe I'll learn something. And you can say to the person honestly, let me tell you, if this election was stolen, I want to know. I mean, I don't want to live under a stolen election. I'm sure you don't either, David. Right. So if there's any evidence that this was stolen, I certainly would be grateful to hear about it. And I think you can say that. I think anybody can say that and mean it.
What about with one that can be sometimes when the topic lends itself more to the ideas of experts and who counts as an expert? It can get much more dicey. So, for example, we could think about COVID and vaccines, right? Where there's not only a disagreement about facts, there's a disagreement or misunderstanding about who is a valid authority and about the differences between facts and opinions. Oftentimes, what are opinions are put out there as if it is the type of statement that counts as a fact, when really it's only an opinion. And it seems that it's a much tougher hill to climb, seemingly armed only with the Socratic method of questioning. How would the application be different in such circumstances?
Well, I don't think so, because I think you can still ask questions about other situations where people defer to experts. Like you might say, let's talk about are there any vaccines you do take? Well, why do you take those? Are there situations where expert opinions are enough for you? Because there are for me. And I think actually most of us defer to experts sometimes. And so the question is, when? And can you find a case where the answer is yes? And then what are the features of that case? And then how do the features of that case compare to the features of the case that's in controversy? I think that's the Socratic idea is you always try to find something that's go move over to an easier case where you can agree and then establish some things you can agree on. Because usually what's going on is in the controversial case, everybody's judgment is clouded by other features of it, by the politics of it, or the rooting interests that you have, like almost like as a sports fan. And so you're trying to go find a case that is not clouded by those things and establish your principles there, and then gently move them over into the case that's giving everybody more trouble.
What about specifically when where sometimes the struggle will be when people will call me, I might present what are what I see as data and reports about a particular issue, and someone will say, well, my experience is just different. So it's an anecdote, right? We're talking about anecdotes versus empiricism. And it's very easy and reflexive to say that's an anecdote and we need to look at broader evidence. But people are often pretty resistant to that. They'll say, no, I mean, listen, this is what I experienced. And so this is real to me in some sense. What sort of advice do you have in that type of situation?
Well, I mean, I think first just listen to people. I mean, nobody's going to listen to you unless they feel like you listen to them. So if your immediate reaction is obvious contempt for their experience, then you're just not going to be off to an effective start. But let's imagine that you've done that. And I think at that point, maybe the most helpful way to reason is to ask, well, how do they feel when people make similar claims that are anecdotal or about their own experience, but who they don't agree with? I mean, because that's the kind of claim that people can't stand when it's made by those on the other side. So trying to think of an example, I mean, that's what I think in general is if you can flip the politics in a situation, like imagine exactly what you're saying, but imagine somebody on the other side making that claim. You can ask somebody, what would you say to them? What would you think of the strength of that claim? I mean, I'm not trying to tell you how you'd feel, but how do you think you'd feel? And of course, it's always perfect if you can think of an actual example and say, well, what you're saying reminds me of somebody I knew and that you may have heard about, who actually made a very similar claim, but except that they love everything you hate. And I just wonder, how would you work with that person? And say, well, that person's just wrong. Well, I know you think that, but they don't think that. So what would, I guess what you'd probably say to them is their ideas about what counts as evidence don't seem very strong. And then maybe you've got an inroad. I mean, these are hard. These are not conversations that, you can expect, in which you can expect to turn somebody 180 degrees. The question is, can you make a little headway?
Yeah, it seems that although there is a sort of Socratic toolbox, that it's really more of a framework. Is that fair to say than a sort of how-to?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it is. There is sort of a toolbox. There are a lot of techniques that Socrates uses, but it's also just a mindset and a stance of sort of humility and awareness of your own arrogance and ignorance. You're trying to learn from others in good faith. So I don't think it's a paint by numbers scheme for questioning, but if you do study the method in the book, the Socratic Method that I've written tries to provide some sort of guidance on that. I think it provides you with an approach to hard conversations that can be more productive than just arguing with people directly and contradicting them.
Is there a connection beyond just what seems to be superficially a little bit of overlap between Socrates and Stoicism?
Well, I would say so. The Stoics regard, and when you talk about Stoicism, of course, you're talking about the philosophy. The word Stoicism in modern English has a sort of a meaning of grim endurance, of
Yes.
suffering, or unfeeling. And ancient Stoicism is a much richer, more interesting set of ideas than that. It's really not what it's about. And I think it's a very rewarding body of thought. The Stoics regarded Socrates as their hero, and they thought they were descendants of his. And indeed, I think if you're interested in Stoicism, one feature of the book on the Socratic Method is it's sort of meant to be helpful in helping show what the origins of the great Stoic ideas were, because most of them can be traced back to things Socrates said.
If we go back to that era and we think about the trial and execution of Socrates, does that tell us something about just the general distaste many have to have their beliefs questioned?
Well, no doubt it does. I mean, it's important, I think, when you're thinking about the ancient world, not to imagine these were the good old days of unfettered discourse. Some people would say Socrates was the first victim of cancel culture. He was canceled pretty good. I just think the way I'd put it is the Socratic mindset is never going to be the majority mindset because it's too contrary to how human nature works. People fundamentally crave confirmation of what they think by others. So somebody who's asking questions that are uncomfortable is never going to be popular. Wasn't popular 2,500 years ago, isn't popular now. But I think it's a very noble and important role. And it's also, I'd say the same thing about any individual. The Socratic function or the Socratic aspect of your own mind is never going to be the predominant one because even in your own psyche, just like in the social world, it's never the strongest force. It's always sort of a minority position. But I think everybody can use a stronger Socratic attitude within their own self, as well as finding use in the Socratic method when they're dealing with others.
The book is The Socratic Method, a practitioner's handbook. We've been speaking with the book's author, Ward Farnsworth, who's Dean of the University of Texas Law School. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, David. Great to be here. I appreciate yours.